Hello, my creative friends. It's time to take another art break, and I've created another sweet little bunny painting for you. I've named her Betty the Bunny, and she's been out busily picking a box full of carrots. I'm going to walk you through the watercolor steps to show you how I brought Miss Betty to life, and then I'll show you in the end how to add a little bit of scribbly bits using some color pencils, because it's not a PaintingCrafty painting unless it has a little bit of scribble bits. For those of you who'd like to paint along with me, but drawing's not your thing, I do have a sketchbook membership. That's where I have all the line tracers for any of the paintings I do on my YouTube channel. You can just click that QR code, it'll take you right over there. The membership is very reasonably priced, and I so appreciate all those who become members and support my channel that way. Well, let's get started, and I'll show you how I brought Miss Betty the Bunny to life. Just as a quick reminder for those who have the tracers, I like to use a light box. You can do this on a window too, but I lay the tracers down, then put my paper on the top. Then I can easily go over it and trace with a pencil. Once they're traced, you're gonna have your watercolor, your paper all ready to go. And then to lighten any of your lines or your pencil lines, you can use a kneaded eraser and go over anything. That will just pick up the graphite, but it won't smear it on your paper. Well, let's get started and we'll paint this little cutie. When creating a watercolor painting, I find it very helpful to do a swatch of my colors that I want to use in my painting. Because watercolor is translucent layers, there really is not a way that you can change your colors very easily when you're creating a watercolor painting. So it's a good idea to swatch your colors and then know the direction you're going to be heading before you start your painting. I drew this bunny with lots of whimsical character, from the little round glasses on her face to those big old garden boots on her feet. But I also wanted to add a little tiny bit of fun folk art color, and I was going to accomplish that by creating the color palette of the teal and the red. That's very much a classic looking folk art color pattern, but doing the watercolor kind of gives a little bit of more of a contemporary feel to that folk art pattern. The color of teal I was mixing up off to the side. I mixed it to a little thicker than coffee, not quite as thick as cream, somewhere in between there. It's kind of a darker color, but you're still going to layer it on light and bright first and then work your way darker. When I say darker, you can use the same color, but because watercolor is very translucent, each layer you put on of the same color, those layers will just get subtly darker. When you're doing watercolor, you want to think in your mind about where are my highlights and where are my shadows. So on my little rabbit's dress, I want to have a little highlights on the outside of her arms, little darker areas around the apron, and perhaps just a tiny bit that would be on the outside of her dress too. Those would be the natural areas that would be a little darker. And by adding the little areas of the darkness and the light, you're going to make more of a contour painting look. It's like with any other style of painting in any other medium. If you take the extra time adding the highlights and the shadows, it's going to take your painting to a whole new level of interesting to look at. Now that I finished the dress, I need to choose an area to paint next that's not touching that blue area. Because watercolor has that unique property of wanting to float wherever the paper is wet, I need to choose an area that's not touching it so I can keep my colors pure. If I end up touching that dress, my colors are just going to bleed right into each other. So I'm going to be working on the boots. I left a little white rectangle on my boot because I wanted to create a patch there. If I had covered it all with red, that red would really affect the color that I put on the top. So I want to leave that paper bright white underneath there so I can have a totally different look of where the patch is. When creating my paintings, I like to create a little sense of balance in them by using my colors not just in one area, but to have them in different areas as well. So on this one, I'm going to take the red from her boots and I'm going to be putting it on the band of her hat. I'm also going to use that red on the heart, creating a few little patterns on her apron, and that's just going to give it a nice balance. Another way I can add a little bit more balance to my painting is to make sure my colors are varying in intensity. Because the dress is very darker color and my red is a very rich color, I decided to make my bunny just a light brown color. So I mix my brown to almost a little lighter than tea, just a tiny bit of color. I'm going to be making that on my bunny and also on the apron. That lighter color will just contrast off of having all those rich, bright colors of the turquoise and the red. The box she's holding is a wooden one, and it has slats on it, so those front wooden pieces need to be your lightest shades of brown, and then in between it, that will be a darker, richer shade of brown, so it looks like there's a front and an inside. I'm also going to water down that paint and create that on the cuffs of her little dress. Now, if you get too much of that paint on there, because you don't want it to look brown, you do want it to look a little light, you can always go in, rinse your brush out with some clean water, tap it on your paper towel, and then lift some of the color out. And here you can see where I accidentally touched the heart and the color wasn't all the way dry, so it wants to just bleed into the apron color I'm putting on. Now red does stain your paper fairly well, so it's a little hard to lift that color, but I will give it a chance to dry, and then I'll come in with a slightly damp brush and then tickle that area and see if I can't lift some of that red color out, or at least soften it so you don't notice as much where it accidentally ran into the color of my apron. I drew her little dress with a small little band at the bottom, and I was going to be making that the same color as the apron. I was going to be using the same watered down brown to create the shadows on her hair, and I'm leaving bright pops of the white from the paper showing through to create the highlights. I was going to use that same color as well for the outside of the brown area for her ears. Now to add the next layer of red, I'm mixing this paint to about the consistency of cream, so it's a little thicker. I'm going to be adding those darker shadows at the very top, so it definitely looks like her legs are inside of her boots. I'm going to be adding that darker shade of red to the bottom and to the little buckles on the front. I'm also going to be adding just a little darker shade on the heel side of her boots as well, going all the way up to the cuff. The cuff needs to be a little lighter because that would be forward on the boot and it wouldn't be the same color. So you're going to try to lead the cuff of your boot just a little bit lighter, and everything else will have shadows down below. Once I had the boots done, I was going to be moving to those other areas where the red was. I was going to be adding another layer to the heart, and then creating a little checker pattern on the front of her apron, going every other one red and leaving white paper in between. I'm also going to be adding just a few little dashes of red to the cuffs of her dress and going up to the brim of her hat or the band of her hat and adding another layer of red there. Now let's go ahead and paint a little bit of orange on the carrots. Again, this is going to be my lightest shade of orange, and I'll be layering on another layers of the orange as it dries. For my oranges, I did leave just a tiny few little areas of the white paper showing through to create a really bright highlight on my carrots. Once those carrots are dry, this is a good time to check your blue to see if you need to darken up your shadows at all. I was coming back in and just tapping just the slightest bit of that blue color here and there to deepen up the areas that I wanted to be darker. I wanted to add just a tiny bit more of that blue someplace else in my painting, and the perfect spot was for the watering can. On her stockings, I had already washed just a slight bit of that light brown over the top first, and now I was going to be using the same color that I used for the carrots to create the little stripes across those. Because the boots were dry, I could go to the other side and work on the lettuce. I mixed up a light shade of green, put that all over the lettuce, and then chose another darker shade of green and just tapped it here and there. And because the color was already wet underneath and I mixed that darker color on the top, it's going to create its own little watercolor blends, and I won't have to do a lot. I can just tap in a little bit of the dark and let it dry and see what happens. To add the shadows to the watering can, I went back into my blue and laid in a little darker area on the inside of the can, underneath the spout, and on the inside of the handle. Now to add a little bit of more color to her face, I'm going back into that red color, watering it down a lot, adding just a little bit of that red to one side of her nose, and then going to the outside where her cheeks would be, put a band of that color, and then rinse my brush out with clean water, squeeze it, and then I'm tickling that color to soften it and to give those pretty blush cheeks to my little bunny. To create the green tops for the carrots, I'm using the same color of greens that I used for the lettuce. I'll be adding all the little details using the pen work. So this is just basically a tapping of the color here and there to create the little green tops. Now to add the shadow layer to the carrots. I took my orange and I mixed just a little bit of the burnt sienna color in it, and I chose which side I wanted to add the shadow on. I chose the left side. For the posts in the background, I mixed up a shade of brown to about the consistency of coffee. I want the posts to be fairly light since they're in the background. I have found a good way to paint the post is to do the vertical strokes first, up and down, and then come back in and do individual strokes going across. That just gives it more of a whimsical look and adds to that folk art style. I also use that same shade of brown in the foreground. I make sure I have it underneath her boots and the vegetables and those different areas to anchor my picture. I use that same shade of brown to start the inside of the box. So I'm going to be painting around my carrots, and that will be the inside of my box. I want that to be darker than the wooden slats on the front. I also add just a little bit more color to that, and that's the beginning colors of the inside of my sunflower. For the stems and the leaves of my sunflower, I'm going to be using the same color that I used for the lettuce and the tops of my carrots. Now to work a little bit on the hills of the background. I was going to be starting with that same turquoise color that her dress is painted in, but because it's in the background, I need it to be a lot lighter. So I'm going to add a lot more water to that color. I'm going to brush that color all over the hills first, and then I'm going to use the same greens that I had used before and brush a little bit of that over the top of the turquoise. And because the turquoise is wet and the green is wet, it's going to work that little bit of watercolor magic where it makes its own little blends. I'm going to put a layer on, let it dry, and then see how it dries and how much I need to deepen it from there. To help anchor the post to the ground, I will use some of the greens that I have already used and wash it just right at the baseline. This shade of green should be darker than the hills in the background. To create a dark shadow for my watering can, I mixed up a little bit of my black to a very loose tea consistency, and I'm washing just a little bit of shadow over the top of that blue. My red has dried, but I need to add one more darker layer to the red. I mixed a little bit of rust color into my red, and that's what I'm using to really deepen those shades where I want it to really pop more of a darker shade of red. I'm going to be adding it to the boots. I'll add a little bit more of that dark area to one side of my heart. I'll also top the little checkered patterns and work on that hat band just a little bit more. The center of my sunflower is dried as well, and it needs another layer of brown just to boost the color on that area. This painting has some little tiny honeybees that are off to the side, and I'm tapping just in the little bit of yellow color onto them. I'll be putting the black stripes in using a micron pen. I'm going to start with my sunflower using that same bright shade of yellow. I'm going to use the same bright shade of yellow for her hat. Once I have the yellow on, I'm taking just a little bit of that rusty color and tapping that on there for the dark shadows of the hat. Because that yellow is wet and the rust color is wet, it's going to do a little bit of its own watercolor magic where the colors will blend on their own. I go back into that yellow and layer another shade of yellow and do the same thing by picking up some of that rusty brown and tapping it on the sunflower while my yellow is still wet. Those colors will blend together really nicely and create a real pretty shade of a rusty gold sunflower. I go back into my greens, and this is when I'm going to be darkening those up as well. I had washed a little bit in the background underneath the grass into the dirt, just to blend those two areas together. Now I'm layering on just a little bit more green on the big head of lettuce and adding some more of the turquoise and the green in the background. I just don't want to get too dark with that color. I still want it to make it feel like it's in the background, so I want that color to be less intense than the colors in the foreground. Give everything a dry, take a look at how it dries, and then I can decide if I need to add more shadows. For this guy, I decided I wanted kind of more of that color that was similar to the apron and the color of my rabbit for the background. So first I wet my paper with clean water and then went into the brown colors and just washed a little simple layer in the background. I wanted the interest to be in the foreground and just left the background sky more of a neutral color. I'm almost done with the watercolor steps. I'll give this a dry, and then I'm going to be adding all the little scribbly bits using some color pencil. Before I add the color pencil, I'm going to be adding my line work using a micron pen. I'm using the nib size 01. That seems to work fairly well. It's fairly small. I have found that the 005 doesn't necessarily work that well on watercolor paper because it has a slight bump on it. But I'm going to be using my micron pen and just doing irregular kind of sketch lines. I'm not outlining it completely. I'm going to be using it to color in my eyes as well. I left the inside of my eyes white, and I'm taking the black pen and just scribbling in a dark area at the base of my eyes, but then trying to leave just a little catch light by not filling it in all the way. If you happen to lose your catch lights, you can always go back in with like a uni ball pen or just even a dot of white paint to create that little highlight. Once you put the highlights into your eyes, that really does bring your character to life. Micron pens are a favorite of mine because it's a permanent ink once it's dry. You won't have to worry about it smearing around if you need to add more watercolor, or if you go ahead and clear coat it with a spray varnish, your micron pen will stay put. Now let's add a little bit more interest by using some color pencil. I like using the color pencil on top of the Canson watercolor paper. All watercolor papers have different textures, and Canson's is a little bit smoother. I tend to like the color pencil on a smoother paper. I wanted to remind everyone that watercolor is not a permanent art medium, and it will need to be protected some way. You can either do that by putting your painting underneath glass, or you can even use a spray varnish on the top, or I even like to use a wax to completely seal in my painting. Well, Betty the Bunny is almost finished. Let's take a look at what she looks like sitting in my studio amongst some of the other spring things I've created so far on my YouTube channel. If you enjoyed creating in this whimsical style, you definitely want to check out this playlist. It's full of whimsical animals and fun spring projects. Well, here is Miss Betty looking cute as can be. She has that sweetest little whimsical look, and I love all of the little extra scribbly bits that brought her to life. Well, if you're new to my channel and you like doing art and crafts, come on over and see what I'm doing. I'd love to have more creative friends join me. Leave me a comment, give me a thumbs up. It really does help YouTube push my videos out there. Well, thanks for joining me, and hopefully you'll come back and join me again, and perhaps next time you'll create right along with me.